Hello everybody, my name is Jeremy and you're watching The Morgue, where we take an in-depth look at the innards and entrails of the MMO gaming industry. And now today we're going to be taking a look at two new combatants to enter the MMO battlefield, as two big-name franchises appear to be throwing their hats into the ring in the very near future. In addition to that, I'll finally be sharing some editorial commentary on the beginning of the life of Rift, and whether or not I feel like there is a promising future for this newcomer to the MMO landscape. Before we get into any of that, however, I would like to give you all an update on a story that we covered on last week's episode of The Morgue. Namely, Atari's announcement that they intended to divest themselves of Cryptic Studios. Just this morning, Perfect World Entertainment announced that they had penned a deal to purchase Cryptic Studios for $50 million. That's a pretty good price in my opinion. Now at this time, since the story only developed this morning, there's not a whole lot of information to be had on the details of this transaction or when it will actually go down. Also, since Atari is a publicly traded company, I've been unable to get any commentary from anybody at Atari or Cryptic until the sale is final. Now I only have a couple thoughts to share with you really quick on this, because the story is so new. The first of which is that I'm honestly a little bit worried. You see, the majority of Perfect World Entertainment's portfolio is comprised of free-to-play titles, whose established cash shops have already set up very many situations where the atmosphere of those individual titles has become a pay-to-win situation, to the point where players are sometimes spending thousands of real-life dollars just to get a leg up in combat, or just to be able to hold their own from other players who are willing to spend such exorbitant amounts. Now couple this with the fact that Star Trek Online's executive producer has come out and mentioned in the past that he is interested in taking a look at the free-to-play landscape. I can see Star Trek Online at least moving towards that payment model at some point in the very near future. But that's just my speculation on the matter. Now the other point that I'd like to make is that I'm actually optimistic about this partnership for one key reason. You see, contained within the press release itself is the following quote: Cryptic Studios' highly reputable development team and its technology platform will further strengthen our well-established R&D capabilities. The fact that Perfect World Entertainment seems not only interested in buying Cryptic Studios' games, which could potentially turn them a quick buck, but actually investing in the technology and the research and development of further tools, well, that sounds right up Cryptic's alley, to be honest, and I think that this is a partnership that will be beneficial to both parties in different ways. It implies that Perfect World Entertainment is very interested in not only the games, but the engine itself, as well as the Foundry technology, which, as I mentioned in last week's episode, are some of the primary strengths of Cryptic Studios. Now that's all the commentary that I have at this time because the story is so new. If you'd like to hear more thoughts on the subject, I would encourage you to tune into this week's episode of Stoked, the Ultimate Star Trek Online podcast, which will be airing on Tuesday, June 7th. And now with all of that business out of the way, let's go ahead and take the plunge into our editorial on Rift. Well, here we are coming up on the 3-month anniversary of the launch of Trion Worlds' flagship MMO, Rift. Now, 3 months after the launch of any big-budget MMO is usually a good time to sit down and take an analysis of how they've been doing within the first few months of their lives. The honeymoon period is starting to end, and we can start to get a good impression on whether or not long-term success is in the cards for this particular title. Now, before I share my thoughts on this matter, I'd like to thank everybody that's joined the active conversation that we've been having going on over at JupiterColony.com. Some of your comments have been really eye-opening and have led to me making my own decision about certain aspects of the game, or doing initial research in order to properly formulate my opinions on the matter. Hopefully this conversation will continue even further now that I'll be publishing my own thoughts on the matter, so I look forward to seeing more of you in that thread. Alright, that out of the way, I'm going to jump straight into the deep end here and make the big comparison, which I think has been thrown around like water on a blazing fire whenever the conversation of a review of Rift comes up, and that is the comparison to World of Warcraft. This comparison is apt in 1,000 different little ways. The most notable for me is the actual structure of the adventuring portion of the game, where the abundance of kill, click, fetch, and deliver quests makes it feel like any other MMO on the market. When you couple this with the very familiar feel of the basic UI elements of the game, along with the combat mechanics of the game also feeling like the same old whack-a-mole that you play in World of Warcraft, this game feels like a clone. I'll just say it. Now, I realize that within this market, it's not so important to most gamers who did what first, but who did what better. And that's really where Rift starts to run into a few little speed bumps. You see, they've crafted a game that is so similar to the MMO juggernaut that is WoW, that the few areas in which they fall just slightly short, instead of being the minor oversights that they might be in a more original and innovative title, become glaringly obvious faults, because this new title is being compared with the mature development cycle that WoW has been treated to. Some of those notable oversights are, sadly, the content. When you get right down to it, Rift has not rolled out of the gate with sufficient content to actually be a competitor to WoW. Now, I realize there's a large portion of you guys out there that are saying, well, WoW has had 7 years to flesh out their content. Well, as a player of WoW at the time of launch, I can already remember there being more content at the time of launch than Rift currently has now, which was only later expanded upon as new dungeons, new instances, new continents, and expansion packs continued to roll out. Plus, if Rift is really trying this hard to be a competitor to WoW, which even their ad campaign speaks to, then they can't afford to be trying to compete with what WoW was 7 years ago. They have to look at what it is now and be a competitor to the now. Now, Rift is also missing a few smaller features, which again, if this was a more innovative, original title, would not be anything worth worrying about. But when you're doing something that is so similar to another title, you kind of have to have these. The most notable example of this is the guild bank system, which currently does not exist in Rift. Now, on the other hand, I would like to point out that Trion Worlds has already implemented a brand new looking for group tool, less than 2 months after the launch of their title, whereas it took Blizzard many, many years before they were able to implement it in WoW. So if Trion can stick with this development cycle and continue to roll out new UI elements and new tools and new features on a regular recurring basis, then maybe in a year, they'll actually be ready to compete with WoW. Now, the last area where I feel like Rift falls down is somewhere where I actually think is more important than those other two that I just talked about. Content is great, small features are great, but the problem with Rift, in my opinion, with comparing it to WoW, is the lack of any form of solid class balance. Because of the open-endedness of Rift's Soul system, it has been extremely difficult for Trion Worlds to continue to balance this system, and despite every patch, including tweaks to various class abilities and racial abilities, the simple fact of the matter is that they're not getting to a point where PvP combat in particular is really balanced. Now, this is a region where I think that WoW is vastly superior, where their more structured and limited form of talent building allows for the opportunity to have a more equitable combat experience. In fact, it's gotten so bad in Rift that some players feel like Trion's just throwing up their hands and saying we'll fix it later because it's just too big of a hassle right now. Now, Rift is not entirely a clone. Calling it such is not doing justice to the few ways in which it has broken the mold. It has strayed away from being just another WoW wannabe and really blazed a trail all of its own. The most obvious example of this is, of course, the Rift events, which have taken dynamic open-world content to an entirely new level within the MMO genre. We've seen similar events of this nature in the past in games like Anarchy Online and Warhammer, and even to a certain extent, Champions Online. But the events that take place within Trion Worlds Rift and the interaction that you can have with these events as a player truly make you feel to a certain extent like part of a living world. This is not an easy feat to carry off in an MMO. And despite these Rift events being a very innovative and fun and exciting feature for the game, they don't pan out for the entire lifespan. In fact, it's been noted that most players at the end game don't even bother ever acknowledging that rifts exist. The few gear rewards and other things that you can get from grinding out rifts and getting tokens and such pale in comparison to what you can get from running the end-game instances and raids. And the rifts themselves don't exist in such areas except as elements of the story, and not as dynamic events. Now, the other big complaint that I've heard about rifts from many other players, and actually I've experienced this myself, sometimes we just like to play games to turn our brain off. And even though a lot of people out there, a lot of gamers out there like to complain when a game feels too grindy, I'm willing to bet that the majority of you like to occasionally grind. It's a nice way to just shut your brain off and have a little fun with the game. Well, if you're in the middle of one of your brainless grind quests and all of a sudden a rift pops open on your head, you're no longer allowed to have that no-brain time. All of a sudden, you're swept up in the events of some massive world-changing dynamic situation and forced to either resolve it or flee. and are no longer, in either case, allowed to go about your business and continue your playtime in the manner that you chose to play. But all of these opinions aside, it's important to take a good look at some solid metrics. Through the research that has been done by several people over on Jupiter Colony, I've been pointed to an ongoing live census, which is an unofficial account of how many people are playing on every single server attached to Rift. Now, according to this census, many of the most popular servers out there are actually seeing a fairly significant growth in overall population within the last few months. And while this at first may seem like a growth of the overall audience of the game, at the same time, some of the less populated servers are actually seeing an overall decrease in the amount of concurrent users logged in at prime time, meaning that this shift from the less populated servers to the more populated servers, well, it's probably going to lead to some server merges in the near future. However, this also indicates that there is a steady, slight growth in overall population. And despite the initial 30-day period showing a very significant drop-off in overall population, well, to be honest, most of the community seems to have considered this a good thing, with sort of a good riddance attitude so that they're no longer squelched by the masses of squealing imbeciles. Additionally, this has almost completely eliminated the queue times at all but the most populated times of day, and has actually managed to strengthen the community of this game. So just how many people are playing this game? Well, according again to this unofficial census, each of the major servers attached to Rift is able to support at prime time just under 1,000 concurrent users before queue times start to kick in. Now, I realize that number sounds pretty low, and to be honest, it is kind of low for an individual world, and it does speak volumes about the amount of content that is actually available for players to participate in. But as far as the overall population of the game, well, at this time, there are 58 servers available to connect to for US customers, and an additional 41 for European customers. Even if each of these servers only averaged 500 concurrent users at maximum load during prime time, that's still a concurrent user base of approximately 50,000 users, which in my opinion is a really darn good number. And considering the fact that your total concurrent users is never a huge percentage of your overall subscription base, it would not be out of the realm of possibility for Rift to be sporting over 1 million subscriptions right now, actively enjoying their title. So, overall, I would honestly consider Rift to be a success at this time, but only for a very specific type of gamer. One type of gamer that might enjoy this title is somebody that's been playing WoW for a very long time, but is either grown tired of the age of the title and the associated graphical elements, or the rigid class structure that WoW implements. There also may be a small sect of players that enjoy WoW's interface but don't want to mess with all the UI add-ons in order to achieve some level of customization. Well, Rift's basic UI, out of the box, despite having many similarities to World of Warcraft, is actually completely customizable in a number of very impressive ways. And the last type of gamer that I think would really enjoy Rift is somebody that enjoys smaller communities and smaller population limits on the server that they play on. These smaller populations allow you to develop a stronger sense of community when you say the same names over and over whenever you reach your capital or while you're adventuring out in the wilderness. If you're only seeing the same small section of a few dozen people at any time, you tend to recognize people and you tend to create community bonds, even if it's just like, oh yeah, I know that name. Whereas if you're just one in a mass of hundreds, such bonds are much less likely to form. One more type of gamer that I think would potentially really enjoy their time in Rift is somebody that is brand new to MMOs. Somebody without expectations of the level of content that they would enjoy or the amount of restrictions that are typically placed upon class progression within any title that they play. Rift is honestly a great newbie experience. And as you saw earlier in this editorial, just about the only disparaging comments I could come up with are the fact that it's so similar to an established juggernaut within this industry. So where does that leave the future of this game? Well, sadly, despite the success that it's experiencing right now, I'm not sure that I can see this game lasting over the long term. To really get an indication of its long-term success as an established franchise within the MMO genre, I think we need to wait until another big title comes along and find out whether or not the people that are playing Rift right now and enjoying it are just biding their time until the next big thing comes along. Because as you may recall, Rift was supposed to be the next big thing. And the type of gamer that looks for that sort of experience is likely to look again. So as we draw closer to some major title launches later this year or early in 2012, such as Old Republic and Guild Wars 2, I think that is where Rift will finally get to test its mettle against the rest of the industry. Well, now that I'm done thoroughly chewing to pieces one of the biggest competitors to recently enter the MMO market, I'd like to share with you guys some news about a big franchise that may soon be entering the MMO landscape. Which franchise? Unfortunately, we don't know yet. The announcement at this time is that 2KGames has recently entered into a partnership with XL Games, which is the development studio headed up by lead developer and creator of Lineage, Jake Song. This partnership is specifically for the purpose of developing and publishing a massive multiplayer online game for the Asian market based upon one of 2KGames' top-selling franchises. Unfortunately, the announcement itself did not tell us exactly which franchise that would be. So, let the speculation begin! Now, first of all, I want to clarify something that because of the nebulous and slightly confusing wording of the press release itself, it sounded as though Take-Two Entertainment may be offering up some of their other franchise IPs as a part of this partnership. But the rest of the wording throughout the entire announcement seems to indicate very firmly that the partnership is between 2K and XL, meaning that franchises and IPs owned by Take-Two under developers like Rockstar will not be included in this deal, and we can throw out the speculation right now. That includes Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption, and LA Noire. There is nothing within the wording of this actual agreement that seems to indicate that any of those would be up for the MMO treatment under XL Games. However, 2KGames has a pretty expansive list of franchises that it does own the rights to, including Borderlands, BioShock, XCOM, Dungeon Siege, Civilization, Pirates, and many, many more. Now, I can tell you what I'd like to see happen here. You see, 2KGames has a history and a good track record of allowing innovations and new ways of thinking to enter into the game systems of their first-person shooters. Most notably, BioShock and Borderlands helped us rethink what exactly was possible within a first-person shooter. And the early footage coming out of their new relaunch of XCOM and Duke Nukem Forever just further seemed to solidify that fact. I would love to see 2KGames take this innovation and outside-the-box thinking for shooters and turn that into what could be the first ever successful MMO shooter. To be honest, I don't really see that happening though. 2KGames and Take-Two Interactive are big enough players within this market. I don't see them taking a risk on such a subgenre that has such a spotty record. And while they could potentially still adapt some of those first-person shooter IPs and franchises over to an MMO, to be honest, the one that I see the most likely to be adapted is Dungeon Siege. We're coming up on the third installment of Dungeon Siege to be available soon. And the world is so rich with lore and story and backstory and locations and enemies and factions, and all of this is so well established that adapting it into a massive world for the purposes of an MMO would be relatively painless, since a great deal of the conceptual side of the development cycle is already done. But the same could be said of practically any of the franchises on this list. Nonetheless, that's the one I see the most likely. Now, since this game is being developed for a Korean market, though, it's kind of a crapshoot since I don't really have any idea which of these IPs would be seen as the most appealing to that particular market. I'd love to hear your comments on the concept, though, and maybe we can set up a few bets on the side. Now, speaking of on the side, another thing that has come to my attention throughout watching this deal is a game that was previously off my radar completely. XL Games is actively developing a game known as Arc Age, which somehow completely slipped my radar until I started doing more research into the company. And I'll be frank, it looks fantastic. And I don't mean just looks, but all of the reviews I'm seeing about this game really have me excited for the possibility of an eventual English translation of the client, as right now it's only going to be available in Korean at time of launch. The game is currently undergoing its third beta phase, and I will be keeping a close watch on it as it comes closer to the launch and the possibility of a localization. Now, at the top of this episode, I did promise to talk about two big-name franchises that would potentially be launching into the MMO space in the near future. Well, we've covered one. The next one I'd like to talk to you about is Mass Effect. Several months back, Casey Hudson, the executive producer of the Mass Effect brand, came out and made the following quote. "A lot of people say that they want to see an MMO. I think that kind of makes sense for this universe. If you get rid of the Reapers and you win that, wouldn't it be amazing to just live on the Citadel or just take a ship to Omega? That makes sense." Now, if this quote was just coming from some dude at BioWare, I probably wouldn't be giving it the time of day or including it on my show. At that point, it would kind of be a non-news item. But recall that this statement was actually made by the executive producer of the entire Mass Effect brand. He's not just some guy. He's the guy. He's the man that can make the decision to move these plans forward. So hearing this kind of speculation straight from his mouth gets me really hopeful that this could potentially become a reality at some point in the future. Now, that quote was made several months ago, and we haven't honestly seen anything more on the subject from BioWare since. But to be honest, I don't really anticipate seeing anything from them until we see the launch of Star Wars: The Old Republic. You see, BioWare is not a small fry company. They put a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of resources into every project that they go forward with, including hundreds of millions of dollars poured into the Old Republic project. If there is even the slightest chance that they won't get a payoff on this particular MMO project, then you can bet your bippy that they won't be jumping into a second MMO right off the bat. And it's extremely likely that they're going to sit on this idea and wait to see how Old Republic does over at least a 6-month period. Now that said, I gotta admit, a Mass Effect MMO sounds like a really great idea for many reasons. I could see this working. And just like I mentioned earlier with the Dungeon Siege franchise, Mass Effect already has an established canon, an established storyline, several subplots going on, a rich history of factions and interactions, as well as, to a large extent, even the gear that you would potentially use within this universe, including armor, weapons, spaceships, land vehicles, and several other technological advances along the way. Additionally, and some people don't really like this fact of Mass Effect, but it does include some sort of pseudo-magic, which despite not being entirely acceptable within the realms of some people's hard sci-fi, is actually a really good thing for a potential MMO. You can implement then things that don't exactly fit with our current theories of science and technology and just call it biotics. And you can also create very flashy effects that are just fun to be a part of as a player. And lastly, the actual pseudo-realism of the astronomy of the Mass Effect universe, the fact that it exists within the galaxy that we know, the Milky Way itself, is something that to date has not really existed in a multiplayer space game of any kind. And experiencing the universe as we know it is a really novel concept, and something that I as a science geek would really geek out on. Now that said, there are a number of reasons that an MMO in the Mass Effect universe could be, potentially, the biggest failure ever. I mean, what would we even be doing as heroes in the Mass Effect universe? If we destroy the Reaper threat at the end of Mass Effect 3, then what are we even doing in the universe? Who are we saving? Why are we here? Why does it matter? That's just a story concern, though. There are bigger concerns with the game itself. You see, the Mass Effect franchise has always been, and in my opinion should always be, a cover shooter, which would not be easy to pull off in the MMO space. In order for a cover shooter to have accurate mechanics, every single zone within the game has to be handcrafted, hand-tested, and hand-fine-tuned to ensure that it's effective for both the scenario that it's designed for and potentially for human versus human interaction. No map of that nature could ever be procedurally generated with any degree of reliability, meaning that the content development schedule for such a game would have to be massive. And speaking of things that are accepted normalities within the Mass Effect universe, what about your crew? Would they just be other players? Like, people? No, if I want to interact with people, I'll go outside. I'm playing video games, darn it. But seriously, I know that Star Wars Tour is going to be including companion characters of some sort, and I could see those potentially being adapted to a Mass Effect MMO, but they would still have to be much more thoroughly fleshed out than what I'm currently seeing coming out of those companion characters for Tour. But who knows, I might be surprised on that front. But, you know, there's really one big sticking point on why a Mass Effect MMO could be really, really bad. And it's a pretty simple one too when you think about it. If you're playing a Mass Effect MMO, you are not Shepard. And how can you possibly defend the universe and be the savior of humankind if you're not Shepard? That just feels wrong. I mean, to a certain degree, Mass Effect is the story of Commander Shepard, and adapting that universe to a larger MMO, I feel like you'd probably lose something along the way. Maybe not enough to sink the title entirely, but it's still something that shouldn't be overlooked. Before I sign off for this episode, I'd like to leave you all with one last little bit of speculation revolving around the fact that Nintendo recently filed with the ESRB for a video game rating on a game that has been titled Zelda Universe. and could possibly indicate Nintendo's motivation to enter the MMO arena at some point in the future by putting us back into the lands of Hyrule. However, it also could mean simply that they're turning their website, also titled Zelda Universe, into a more interactive gaming environment that requires an ESRB rating. At this time, it's all rampant speculation, but I'm kind of good at that. That's all we've got for this week's episode of The Morgue. Join me next week where I'll be taking a look at MMO shooters. I'll try to find out just why exactly PlanetSide did not find the success that Sony wanted, and whether or not they'll be able to avoid those particular pitfalls while developing PlanetSide next. I'll also take a little bit of a preview look at what we've seen so far come out of the promising free-to-play shooter known as Firefall. And if I've managed to get my hands on the demo by that point, I might even have a little bit of commentary on Duke Nukem Forever and how it could potentially teach us something about implementing shooters into the multiplayer landscape. So until then, everybody, play smart and don't stand in the fire. It's making me very nervous. Has this been a long episode, or do I just fail at life? Oh, I don't want it to be a long episode. I think I just fail. I want to just believe that I fail. Before I sign off for this episode, I'd like to leave you with one last...